Hi everybody, thanks very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at MedComms So you'll find information, resources, services, activities and so on freely available to the global MedComms community, by which I mean people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing and so on. And indeed, we do lots of work for people who want to join MedComms, and you'll find lots of career information at firstmedcommsjob.com. So lots of resources to go and have a look at if you haven't seen it already, medcommsnetworking.com. One of the things we do is lots of these webinars, which are great because we can involve all sorts of interesting speakers from around the world. We can involve an audience from around the world, and we'll end up with a video, all being well, on NetworkPharma TV, which can be accessed anytime you like from anywhere around the world. So today, I'm absolutely delighted to have, I'm going to call them Paul H and Paul P and Kathy. And we're going to talk basically about managing pressure in MedComms. And I think, MedComms is a pressurized business. We should, there's no harm in acknowledging that. And once in a while, we're all going to get a little bit stressy. But there are ways and means, perhaps as individuals and organizations, where we can tackle it, we can embrace it, we can deal with it, we can avoid a meltdown. And I'm hoping that the discussion today will help give us some insights into how we're all handling things at the moment. So on that note, without further ado, we'll hand over to Paul H.
Thank you very much, Peter. Hopefully everyone is able to see the slides. There we go. So thank you everybody for joining. Obviously there's an awful lot going on in the world outside, and so we really wanted to spend some time talking through a different way of looking at the situation we're all in. Massive thank you for Peter for inviting Fox and Cat to even be a part of this series. We're very excited to be here today. So as Peter mentioned, we're going to talk through a couple of things first off about kind of what is pressure, what is stress, and then move on to a bit about Fox and Cat, and then how as a collective we can help resolve any issues that you might have. We're an agency, Fox and Cat, very small, and we're all about helping to manage pressure. We work mainly with creative agencies, so health comms agencies, other comms agencies, med agencies, but we also can go into advertising, digital, so our kind of remit is quite wide. And we can also work directly with brands if there's a dotted line between us and their existing agency. So just a bit about us. I'll kick off. So Paul Hutchings is my name. I founded Fox and Cat in March this year. And really it came from several areas. I am very passionate about health communications and comms and the roles that creativity play in different agency and business setups. And I've done a health comms role for about 15 or 16 years now. But I actually struggled quite a lot with my mental health towards the end of my time working in an agency. And so I took some time out. I was lucky. I managed to take about a year out to really focus on what was important to me. And I decided that I wanted to not kind of leave all of my experience behind, rather shape it with my personal experiences into something that could help a bit more. So that's a little bit about me. I'll hand over to Kathy and Paul to talk a bit about themselves.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the warm introduction there. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Kathy Chillistone. I'm an independent HR consultant and I specialise in change, engagement and wellbeing. I'm also a licensed Mental Health First Aid England instructor trainer. I support small and medium-sized businesses across a variety of sectors, and I pride myself in being really flexible and responsive in different environments, providing pragmatic support solutions and collaborating with a range of different professionals from time to time, including Fox and Cat, to deliver solutions for those businesses. Over to you, Paul.
Hello everybody, thanks for joining. My name's Paul Phillips. I spent my whole career battling away with pressure and stress working in agencies, and I actually founded and ran the healthcare agency VCCP Health. I left all that behind about 4 years ago, and I now run training in managing stress and pressure and building resilience, all of which is rooted in science and very evidence-based. And I run it with a number of MedComms agencies. In fact, I recognise a couple of names on the list who might well have attended my sessions in the past, plus pharma clients as well. So that's me.
Thanks, everybody. And just to clarify on that as well, the network at Fox and Cat is obviously slightly bigger than the three of us. There's about 25 in total who offer various different levels of specialism and skill towards the mix. So moving on then, I guess the big question really is, what is pressure and what is stress? And actually it's a very hard thing to define. for many reasons. And the best way to look at it is what's happening causing me to have a reaction? And is it a flight, fight, freeze, or fawn reaction? So flight and fright are the ones that fight and flight are the ones that we most regularly kind of recognize. It's kind of ingrained in the way that we've learned to deal with stress. But freeze and fawn are two slightly different ones. Freeze is where you almost kind of get quite rigid. Back in the day with saber-toothed tigers and the like running around, it was quite an effective way to not be seen. Obviously, we don't have those struggles, but we do still tend to live by those kind of evolutionary responses to stress. And fawn is more where you kind of succumb to whatever the situation, you kind of cowered into it slightly because it's just the simpler way to get through. And if people are feeling particularly stressed or anxious or depressed, that can actually be a really quick go-to. You just kind of give up and go with the flow. So if you're ever feeling one of those four responses, that's the indication of stress. So rather than define it, sometimes it's easier just to look at it from that sort of bottom-up approach. Importantly, it affects us all differently. So what affects me today might affect Kathy and Paul very differently, and vice versa. So it's impossible to kind of pin one particular situation on somebody. Somebody might thrive in a pitch environment, whereas others might not, for example. There's also unhelpful and helpful types of pressure. So helpful pressure is that sort of pressure what motivates you to keep going. It encourages us to try different things in a different way, and because of that we grow and succeed. It releases endorphins into the brain, it makes us happy, and the rest of it. Unhelpful pressure, and it's very easy, Kathy will talk a bit more about this in a second, it's so very easy to then flip into this unhelpful type of pressure where you just feel like the world is on top of you, and no matter what you're doing, you're not doing the right thing. And it can be quite a dangerous place to spend too much time in. We are all human, obviously, so we are going to get to that point, but it's all about how can we remain in that more helpful space for longer. And I think really just fox and cat, we are a very human, even though we're called fox and cat, two animals, we're very human in the way that we look at things. And it's absolutely okay to feel stressed. We're not here to kind of say that something's wrong or right. We're here to be there and to say, right, let's just stop. Let's just pause. Let's think about what's going on and we'll help solve the problem together.
Thanks for that, Paul. Lovely lead-in for me to introduce the concept of the stress bucket, also known as the stress container, to everyone joining us today. As we've all alluded to so far, we all have mental health, don't we? Just as we have physical health, and different things in our lives affect it, different bumps along the way, which means that both our mental health and our physical health fluctuate over time. Some of you may already be familiar with the stress bucket or stress container as an analogy, but it's also a free online interactive tool that's available through the Mental Health First Aid England's website, which I'd urge you to make a note of and download later. It's a fun and interesting activity. So the stress bucket tool helps us to reflect on how we're coping at any one time with stress, which will be impacting our well-being, both positively and adversely. So you can consider this tool as an individual, as a team, or as a business as a whole. But for now, I'd just like you to think about yourself. So at any one time, there's a variety of demands and pressures that will be affecting the stress that you're experiencing. So straight away, you might be relating to and thinking about sources of pressure and stress for you at home, perhaps moving house, perhaps illness or bereavement, or perhaps financial stresses and worries, maybe socially, or perhaps in your physical health, across some of your relationships, both personal and also at work, as well as some of the pressures and demands that come with being at work. Sometimes a lack of pressure and challenge and demands in itself is a cause of stress. It's something we don't often give much thought to, but it can be very stressful to be under-challenged. You may feel that sometimes these sources of pressure and stress are within your control and influence, and sometimes that they're not. But either way, you'll know what your go-to methods are to cope. So what worked well for you last week might not work for you today. What helps you cope may not help your friend or your colleague to cope. So when you're coping well, all of the stresses that are coming into this bucket, they flow out quite nicely because you're using your positive coping mechanisms, and the valve on that tap releases that heightened stress of adverse stress or pressure. Okay, so we are able to, with our coping mechanisms, control the flow of the valve or the tap to keep things in balance. It's something we usually have to keep a regular check on. But as we all do, myself included, you'll have your unhelpful coping mechanisms that will affect the valve. So for example, avoidance and procrastination, overworking, poor prioritization, taking less breaks, not making time for lunch or generally poor nutrition, less exercise, fun, and also social time, bottling up your thoughts and feelings, increased alcohol consumption. I'm sure some of these examples will resonate with you, and you can probably all think of more that you know aren't helpful for you. So when this happens, when we cope less well, that flow of the valve slows down. It can become clogged. Maybe it shuts down altogether. And so the water becomes turbulent and it can eventually spill over. This is when we become really stressed. We become less resilient, less able to bounce back, and far more vulnerable. You might already know your stress signature quite well. It could be that you withdraw and become quiet, or perhaps quite the opposite. Maybe you're snappy and easily irritated. It's more likely this will occur when there's too many competing demands, or when the pressures are seemingly outside of your control and influenced. And when that's sustained over a continuous period of time, this is really what leads to burnout that's so commonplace at the moment in our society, resulting in poor mental health, poor physical health, high absenteeism, low morale, high staff turnover, and so on. So at home and at work, there's a shared responsibility to open conversation about well-being, in particular mental health, and keep that conversation going, even if it's uncomfortable. As they say, prevention is definitely better than cure, something my colleague Paul Phillips will now talk to you a bit more about now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. So just drilling down now a little bit into where that stress comes from. What are the causes of stress? And we believe there's sort of three causes of stress, broadly speaking. Firstly, there's the nature of the industry that you work in, how demanding your clients are, and so on. Secondly, there's how you react to situations, the approaches and tools and techniques that you might use to manage your own pressure. And thirdly, there's the workplace environment. How resources managed, how supportive your company is in terms of recognizing and managing mental health issues. Now, the effect of those three things is depicted in this graph on the next slide. As that stress and pressure builds, so our performance increases. And that's because the stress reaction in the body puts sugar into the blood. It generates all sorts of hormones which hype up the body and give us energy to perform better, up to a tipping point in the middle there, where that pressure that we've been able to embrace up to now suddenly turns to bad pressure and becomes anxiety. Now, the area I focus on in the training I run is about tools and techniques you can use to manage your own personal pressure, and therefore just move that bump further back. So we can take the slide down now. I'll just run through a few of the things I talk about. A big area that affects where that tipping point comes is how you manage and reframe your thinking. When you're under pressure, the limbic system in our brain generates all sorts of thoughts as part of that fight or flight response that are helpful if we're trying to run away from an animal, but not particularly helpful if you're working in a business. Also, very often those thoughts are generated very, very quickly because they're a survival mechanism. So they actually hijack the thinking part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, and they generate all sorts of reflex thoughts that are not very helpful and often aren't even true. So the process of managing and reframing your thinking is around understanding and recognizing what I call stress-based thinking errors, thinking traps. I'll give you a couple of examples. Probably the biggest one is catastrophizing, that fear that everything is going to go wrong. The limbic system is very simple. It's trying to say, it's all going to go wrong, run away, run away. A second one is mind reading, jumping to conclusions about what other people are thinking. Oh, the client won't like that, or a colleague thinks this, and so on. How often do we do that and get it wrong? A third stress-based thinking error is something I call the tyranny of shoulds. Whenever you use the word should, ruminating on what your colleagues should have done, on what you should have done, on what your client should be doing, none of which is very helpful because you can't change what's already happened. So the process and techniques I train in are involved in understanding, recognizing those reflex limbic thoughts and being able to step back and pause, strip out the emotion and focus on what you can control, weighing up the pros and cons of different approaches available to you. A second very different way of helping managing that tipping point is how you organize yourself and manage your focus and limit distractions. And I always hear on my workshops people talking about this butterfly, not being able to focus on one thing for very long, looking at a presentation and then picking up their phone and then turning to their email and so on. And of course, technology is wired to keep us distracted. So I always encourage people to be more proactive about how they use their phones, their relationship with their phone. There's various tools and techniques you can use to reduce the amount of time and dependency you have on your phone. Now that also carries in to how you manage your day-to-day workload, being more proactive about it, dividing your work into chunks, allocating pieces of time to each chunk, and having breaks from email, or even better, scheduling times in the day when you look at email. I often see people are looking at their email the whole time, and the work they're doing is a distraction from email, and I recommend turning it the other way around. And finally, something that Kathy also touched on is lifestyle. Different aspects of your lifestyle can have a big impact on stress. Getting enough sleep, for example, understanding how sleep impacts stress, getting enough exercise, those are two things that really limit the stress response. So that's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the things you can do. And that's all from me. Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for talking through that. I just really wanted to bring a few points that we've talked about back to what we do at Fox and Cat. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the stress bucket that Kathy kindly presented through, and ADAPT, which is Fox and Cat's, I guess, strategic planning tool, if you like, for how we identify the root cause of pressure. You'll be very aware sometimes that the often response is, I don't have time to do this, I don't have the capacity. That can be often our reaction, and then the solution can seem like it's, oh, well, we'll get you some more time, we'll give an extension to the deadline. But is that really getting to the systemic reason for why it feels like there's no time? So our ADAPT process helps us really drill into exactly what the reasons are behind that. ADAPT is an acronym. It stands for Align, Discover, Approach, Provide, and Track, which are the 5 key stages of what we do. Over on the right-hand side, you will see 3 blobs that are entwined in a Venn diagram. Now, for simplicity, I've made them all the same size, but really what happens, and these 3 pillars that you see relate back to those stresses Paul talked us through that go into the bucket. And what we do is we work out, we have a planning tool, as I say, that helps us identify where these root causes of pressure are. Are they people focused? So is it about specialism? Is it about skill? Is it about ability? Is it a workplace pressure? Given COVID, given hybrid working, given all these factors, is there a mismatch between where you were and where you need to be? Or is it an industry pressure? Is it something like, actually, it's gone quite flat? You know, the leisure and tourism industry is a prime example. They're experiencing very different pressure to what we would do in health. So what we'll do with this diagram is you'll see it kind of evolve and grow in different ways. And our goal as Fox and Cat really is to help you reach balance in that happy space where the pressure among your people, your workplace, and your industry are in good balance. How that actually manifests itself is through 4 different work streams. So we can, step 1, come in to help support. So if there's a short-term pressure, like you've got key members out or key specialisms missing from a team, then we can help plug those gaps. We also do training, and training is around specialism. So when we do any client service and do any delivery work for you, we will plug into your team. So we will be able to upskill members of your existing team where those gaps were. Our goal is to leave kind of better than we started and upskill people so that we're not needed in that capacity in the future. So that's specialism training. But of course, all the stuff that Paul's talked about, there are many life skills and many resilience and pressure training, which are just absolutely important. They don't just relate to work, they also relate to the way that we live our lives. We can support in the leadership capacity, and really our approach here is around objectivity. It's about that outsider's perspective. You will know your business if you're on the leadership team or whether you're reporting into one. You'll have your perception and your view. Ours is not to negate that. It's merely to provide a different perspective from our experience, either doing your client service, supporting with training, or just from a lay perspective. And finally, and saving the best to last, really, well-being, which is absolutely critical at the moment. Not one person will be unaware of the important value of that. But it's really important to remember that while, of course, when we're under sort of trauma, if you like, as a nation and as businesses, it does last 365 days a year. When we're feeling less pressure, when we're feeling the right amounts of pressure, well-being is as important. And I think sometimes it can end up being a bit of a plaster on a situation, which we're keen to avoid. We want to try and create sort of lasting, meaningful change where well-being is managed and maintained throughout the year, regardless of the pressure. So I hope that's given you all a very good, or at least an introductory stance as to what we do, why Kathy and Paul are so valuable to the Fox and Cat proposition, how independently they're able to support agencies and other businesses with managing pressure. And I think as well, just to end on the point, I'm very aware that obviously people are from different backgrounds, whether that's agency, in-house, freelance, any capacity. There'll be parts of what we talked about that you might relate to more than others, and that's absolutely totally fine. But we'd love to invite any questions. So I will now hand back to Peter and leave some questions for the floor.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul, and indeed everybody. So look, we've got an audience online at the moment. Please, everybody, you've got two text boxes. You've got a chat box and a Q&A box. We'd love to get some comments from you and some questions, which we can weave into this discussion. So we're going to just talk around these sorts of issues that have been raised here. And I mean, we could go in so many different directions at the same time, and I have a tendency to do that, so bear with me. But, you know, 18 months or so after most of us started experiencing lockdowns and all the rest of it, I mean, what I think is really interesting, and I suppose you've touched on it, but I just think it's really interesting is what's happened in the last 18 months, for instance, has put a lot of pressure on people, and it's raised a lot of issues, and it's put this focus on all sorts. But what I think is sometimes not talked about enough is that it's so individual. And you know, I don't run an organization, so I have to speculate a bit about what it's like to run in an organization these days. But if you've got 50 people or 500 people and they're all reacting so very individually, you know, my pressures and stresses are different to yours, and indeed my pressures and stresses yesterday were very different to my pressures and stresses today, and so on. And from an organizational point of view, I find it really interesting to speculate on how people are managing this and the importance of managers. And I suppose that's my question to you is, you know, I think, and somebody said this to me very early on last year, it's really shining a light on managers, because, you know, it's easy to be a manager in an office when people come and they go and they sit and you can see them crying in the corner or whatever. But if you're having to very actively manage people who you might see once a week on a Zoom call, you know, we can all be cheerful. Even I can be cheerful on a Zoom call, and then I turn it off and I go and sob in the corner, and you don't know that. And I just wonder whether you've got some observations on that. You know, the challenge for managers. I know some of the challenges are just, well, you should have been worrying about that forever. But because of what's happened in the last year and a half, it's really brought some of that into sharp sort of into a spotlight. I just wonder what sort of observations you have as to the way that's being managed in organizations. Kathy, just start with you.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to pick up on you've raised a lot of really interesting points and questions there for discussion, so quite happy to kick that off, Peter. Oracle have recently reported that 90% of employees are saying that coronavirus has adversely impacted their mental health. No big surprises there for any of us. They've also reported that 76% of employees believe that their employers should be doing more to address mental health. So there is a huge pressure on leaders and managers to manage and address stress, particularly stress at work. But also, I think in the 21st century, and not just accelerated and compounded by COVID and the nature of work and the design of work, expectations have shifted massively. So there is this shared responsibility to take care of your own health and well-being as best as you possibly can, as well as the provision by an employer to provide a safe, supportive and open environment. But what really does open mean? You know, the culture within one organisation may be very, very different to the next. So what is very open and no barriers and free flowing dialogue may be very difficult and taboo within another organisation. Or it could be the same organisation but different teams, where you know, cultures and subcultures may be either very open and supportive and others perhaps more closed, submissive, or even punitive. So those are my initial thoughts around those points. I didn't know, Paul, if you had any comments you wanted to make in relation to culture and reactive and proactive measures.
Yes, well, one thing I was going to mention is something I heard in one of my workshops. Somebody once said, "I don't care about the free fruit," this was an agency that gave fruit once a week to staff and so on. And what he went on to say is, "I'd much rather the MD told me not to look at my email after 6 o'clock." And it led me to name this whole area of sort of culture plasters, which are things that people introduce to support well-being, and they're good things. Like giving people fruit is a good thing, but at the same time they're expecting people to work long hours or log in at 10 o'clock at night or run telephone conferences with markets at different times and so on. So it's almost like they're a plaster, you know. Thirsty Thursdays, a spa day for people, a half day off here and there. But if you're continuing to drive people really, really hard, and you're not solving that core issue, that work-life balance, I think you'll start to see that that's what people really want. They'd rather not have the fruit, they'd rather have the more basic things. That's what I've seen.
Okay, Paul H., have you got some comments on that from an overall point of view?
I think for me, it comes down the point that you mentioned around the stress that goes on to managers. And I think a really interesting observation is around this kind of middle management position, where you are expected to know an awful lot to help your linees and more junior team members, but also you are very much somebody who needs that support. And I think it's a really important layer that needs to be kind of really considered about what support do they get. There's a huge expectation at the moment for people to be able to provide the solutions. And the reality is, at the moment, we don't have a kind of, you know, almost toolbox to pull off to give these solutions. It's very much growing with the trends, watching out, keeping a watchful eye for what's going on, and bringing those insights into what works for a particular business. So I don't think there is an answer to the question of like, what's the best way? I think it's about really keeping an open mind, making sure that you're kind of teed up to the right resources at the right time. And there will be many from different industries. CIPR, PRCA from a health comms and comms perspective, for example, have lots and lots of great information out there relevant for health comms, and so you need to find the like for your own kind of need. But we're all growing and we're all changing together, and I think any chance that people have to come together with their peers to share support and learnings is always very useful.
I think it's interesting, there's some comments coming in about your culture plaster analogy, which I love, and there's clearly some people in the audience who like it as well. And it's one of my little soapboxes, so I'll go with it just for a moment. But it's like on LinkedIn, and you see all these LinkedIn postings about, oh, it's wonderful, the employer sent me a bottle of wine or a box of chocolates or a funny card or a whatever. And you see that, and it's very social media-ish, you know, and all the rest of it. And you think, well, that's fine. And I'd quite like someone to send me a box of chocolates. But when we've done, but to then draw a comparison like the survey work we've done, and we did a big independent survey last year, which I thought was fascinating, where the people were saying, yeah, but you know, I haven't got a decent computer, or I need a second screen, or, you know, I need better internet access to be paid for, or I'm in a rented flat with a bunch of people. You know, the bottle of wine is great fun for the half an hour it takes you to drink it, and then what? So I think there's some really important points in there, and we can be a bit flippant about it, and maybe we should be actually a little bit sort of blunt about it. You know, employers need to think about this, and I'm sure many are, but it's too easy. The sticking plaster type analogy, I think, is excellent, and I hope people will think about that. But also, what I like about what Kathy said is the individual taking some responsibility, and sometimes I do wonder, and I don't know whether you just have some simple comments on this, is, you know, who is responsible in the end? Maybe just taking Kathy's point a bit further, you know, as an individual, you know, am I supposed to sort myself out? Is the line manager supposed to sort me out? Is the employer supposed to sort me out? You know, I think there must be some interesting conflicts up and down that line, and people are different. And I've seen people in teams who take very different approaches. You know, It's not my responsibility. You're supposed to give me that. Someone else says, oh, for goodness sake, I'll just get on to it. I just wonder, just around that sort of a point of responsibility. Kathy, let's start with you, although you did make your point to begin with, but go, Kathy.
No, that's absolutely fine. I think, you know, there have to be really clearly articulated expectations from the get-go in any employment relationship. Traditionally, in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on, you know, wellbeing and the culture plasters have been very much led as one-off HR initiatives. We all know that those are superficial to some point. Don't get me wrong, I think that if you have the afternoon off or a morning off after a big football match and so on, those things are actually quite important symbols for individuals to see that there's a bit of due regard for work-life integration, not just work-life balance, and recognizing what's important to people. But at the same time, there's more fundamental conversations that need to be had, more authentic and honest conversations about the loss of control or loss of influence over the demands and influence, you know, the influence, the pressure that you experience. Ultimately, it's the fabric of those sorts of things around accountability, responsibility, and authority that need to have a deeper dive and a deeper conversation. And that has to be led, initiated, and pushed through from the senior leaders in the organisation, but supported perhaps by champions, a diagonal slice across the organisation. So irrespective of role or function and so on, there are champions who are able to consult, support, and I suppose steer the culture in the direction that suits the greater need. You know, expectations are shifting all the time, as I've already mentioned, but you know, that doesn't just sit in the lap firmly of shareholders or external agencies or the leadership team. That involves everyone using their voice to say, well, actually, this is what we really think, this is what we really feel, and this is how we'd like that to be designed. Let's have a conversation about the design of how we move forward.
Paul P, can I just bring you in and follow the logic, the thinking there? But you know, you work with agencies about tools and solutions and answers and so on. You know, again, I suppose the question there is how much of it is this is that, you know, you mentioned email. Someone's picked up on the email and the question. You know, you've talked about managing emails. How much of it is, you know, as a company we should stop everybody answering emails after 6 o'clock at night or something, as opposed to, look, guys, some of you like answering emails after 6 o'clock at night, so I'm not going to stop you doing that, but let's get some balance in here, sort of thing. So how much of it is a sort of this is a new rule to put in the company, and how much of it can indeed practically be, well, actually, you all work in different ways, so you work how you want to, just get some more balance. You see what I'm saying there?
Yes, I do. And in fact, the term now used very commonly is the right to disconnect, which completely acknowledges what you were just saying there, Peter, which in other words, it's a right to disconnect. You don't have to. And a lot of companies are now bringing in rules where email is ideally banned, you know, before 7 in the morning or after 7 at night. And when people do choose to respond, they might put a little sign off that says, I've chosen to respond to you at 10 at night. I'm not expecting a response, or whatever it might say. You know, Unilever now have that as an official sign off reply in a time zone and when it's convenient for you. So I think that's the key thing, is giving people that option. And a story I quickly tell about this was an agency I know that introduced this, and they wanted to check with all their clients, you know, are you happy with this office? If something's urgent, our team will be available. And they got an email back from a client, which I saw, which said, you know, thank God for that. I'm fed up with your team emailing me at 9 p.m. at night, and I feel obliged to respond. And that to me sums up exactly what's going on. He did not want to respond, but of course his team at the agency are getting his email and thinking, oh, he does want to engage. Oh, we were right to send him an email at 9 at night, you know, and it just goes on and on and on, a domino effect. And actually nobody wants to be sending email at 9 o'clock, or very few, I would say. So that's why, you know, the right to disconnect, giving people that acknowledgement that they're not obliged to look at email after a certain time. I think it's the way forward.
I mean, again, just to be slightly whatever about this, because I am somebody who does work some odd hours, and I just quite enjoy it, apart from anything else, and I'll take that on, you know, I feel I have to, but actually I quite enjoy it. Let's be honest about it, Peter. You know, I like working, so that's what I do. But the time zone thing, for instance, is a complication here. When you've got people who are in this country, as it were, in the UK, it's gone 6 o'clock, you're not supposed to answer emails, but your US client is just getting into gear, sort of thing. That can muddy the water, can't it?
It can. But what I would also say is it's probably fine if you wait till your own time zone to reply. And I think what often happens with this whole time zone thing is people don't even make any effort at all to recognize somebody else's time zone.
Think about it. Yeah. Even worse, you try and work out exactly what time it is, and we're all getting very confused.
Yeah.
To be honest about it. Let's. I'm just picking up on a couple of these questions. Let's just try and cover a couple of specific questions. And
interesting, actually. Can I just pick up something? Carla is saying, if you want to find work in the US, you aren't afforded the privilege of refusing to answer an email after hours. You will be replaced. Blimey, that is
seems harsh.
I mean, it is now, by the way, the right to disconnect, absolute official rule at Volkswagen. Emails are banned after 7 p.m. Worldwide, as far as I know, and many companies. And it's a law in France. After 7 p.m., you are not obliged to answer emails. And in fact, a company was sued because it expected people to answer email after 7 p.m. One other thing I'll just mention, just to answer your other question, Peter, is I'm a big fan of being really careful with all these different tools. WhatsApp, email, Teams, Slack. What I see in companies is they add these things in, and all they do is they just create this cumulative effect rather than one replacing another, which is the idea. So I would advise companies really be selective on which of these you use, and don't use them all and have clear roles.
Yeah. And a couple of questions touching on, one of the practical problems now, isn't it, particularly in a company, again, I speculate because I observe it, but where you're jam-packed with Zoom meetings, when do you do your emails other than at the end, if you're engaged in the Zoom meeting sort of thing? And there are a lot, and there's a couple of comments here about how many meetings are being shoved in the diary now, because we can all get together and maybe it's easy, or maybe it's like if somebody as a manager is sitting there going, let's have a team meeting, because that's a way of bonding, that's a way of making sure everyone's okay, so let's shove another Zoom meeting into an already busy day to have a bit of a chat. Those sorts of, I mean, and there are problems that come out of that, aren't there? So again, what are your observations about that, the sort of unintended consequences of trying to help?
A piece of research that showed that we spend 70% of our time in meetings and 50% of it is wasted.
Right, yeah.
And whenever I put that to people in my workshops, nobody disagrees. I see people all going, yeah, all around you. So my advice is only have a meeting if you need it. And be certain you need it. Have a clear agenda. How many times do you meet and go, why are we meeting? Right, have a clear agenda beforehand. It's amazing what you can do in half an hour when you might schedule an hour. Try and limit it, and always focus on the most important item first. That's the other tip I give people. Less meetings, shorter, focus on the key thing. Do we really need it in the first place?
Which again, you'd sort of, 2 years ago, you'd have probably said the same thing. It's just the whole Zoom /Teams/ whatever generation, as it were, has just taken it to a silly degree, and it's causing problems. And Paul, let's just pick up on Abby's question, just out of interest. As a new line manager, what tips on deeper questions to ask a line report? So the sorts of ideas you might have as a new line manager, you suspect someone's struggling with mental health. So just a little bit, how do you guide, and what do you suggest in that situation? Which
Paul are you asking?
Oh, sorry, I'm looking at Paul H at the moment. Sorry, I was going to bring Paul H into the conversation.
Thank you. I think actually what I might do, just because Kathy's a lot closer to the mental health.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. I thought I was.
I've got some thoughts. I'd love to just build on any thoughts Kathy has, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think fundamentally it has to be a human-centered approach. We all want to be treated like adults and like human beings first, irrespective of our job title or status. I think, therefore, the line of inquiry needs to be very open, without assumption and suggestion and judgment, with genuine, authentic inquiry. So if you say to someone, how are you? You don't seem yourself today. That suggests urgency. And it suggests that there isn't the time and there isn't the real compassion behind the question. So making the right, creating the right environment to have an open conversation, and offering an olive branch, equally respecting that the response that you receive may be, no, everything's fine, remember that employee, if it's a new relationship, then it's going to take some time to establish some trust, isn't it? It's going to take some time to work through a few bumps to really understand the boundaries and ascertain to what degree that trust is mutual. So as a new manager, I would want to quickly understand what resources were available internally within the organisation to support me as a new manager, as well as to signpost that new relationship with the employee, as well as external sources of support. There may well be an employee assistance programme, there may well be a fully equipped and resourced HR team. There may well be wellbeing champions or mental health first aiders on site who can have that conversation. The conversation around wellbeing doesn't always have to be between the employee and their line manager. It can come from any direction, and I would actively encourage that it should, as we're all people first and employees second.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I think there's a couple of really interesting points there. I've jotted down a few things, and I think for me it comes back to boundaries. Like, what do we feel able to respond to? What is our role in that? We can't overstep the mark, and the kind of always watch out point. I've been lucky enough to do the mental health first aid course with Kathy. She's fantastic, and so I picked up a lot of skills along the way, and certainly ones that I use in my own life. But it's really about understanding where do you feel most comfortable having that conversation, because the last thing you want to do is give advice that could actually go in the opposite direction because you haven't felt confident enough. So there really is a real key to do that. I think the other build to this really, and I think from my perspective as a health comms director in a previous role, we are now not just kind of one team of similar minded people who deliver client service. We have creative people, we have all sorts of disciplines around the edge now, and we don't all think and work the same. And that's really important when you have a conversation with someone about mental health, because you have to really get in, understand their perspective. So it's also about kind of a collaborative approach. Like Kathy says, really understanding that person and their set of circumstances is really going to shape the way that you're able to respond. And I think as well, just as a manager, particularly if you're a new manager, just make sure that you've got the support around you that you need to be able to have those conversations and be quite open and human about it. No one expects, just because you've got a line manager title, that 2 days into that role you're going to know it all. That's not the way it works. And I think sometimes we can get a bit caught up in the title and the role, and just remember to be more human, I think.
Okay. I was slightly laughing at one of the comments that's just come in, because Carla's from the States suggesting that she's going to come and work in the UK.
Carla.
Like,
you're welcome, Carla. Come over.
We're such nice people over here. So, I just thought maybe it's worth for a minute or so. Can we just pick up on Stacey's point? I think we're touching on, but can we go a bit further in terms of respecting boundaries and how it looks different from an employer, employee, manager, team manager sort of thing? And again, it's sort of getting at some of the problem here, which is that everyone's individual. Everyone's trying to work with each other, but they've got different perspectives on everything.
Absolutely. We all have a completely different frame of reference. So our cultural environment, so whether we're in America and the work demands and work-life balance is considered very, very differently than it is in the UK, as we've been open about and explored with Carla today. But also when we think about our immediate cultural lens and view on the world, so our heritage, our background, our upbringing, our privilege, and when we consider the inclusion and diversity agenda, all of these factors will affect how we see the world and how we interact with the world and the people in it, and also therefore how we are treated and how we experience various forms of judgment, perhaps prejudice, and even direct discrimination. And that's a constantly evolving thing, as we've seen in the media for decades, certainly, but particularly with Black Lives Matter and the LGBTQ communities. There's far more going on out in society generally today, as well as within organisations, to look at how they can capture and inspire the right talent within the organisation and attract the right talent to the organisation that really reflects the right attitudes and behaviour, irrespective of the actual demographic profile, if that makes sense.
I just think, just in the final minute or so, on following that line of thought, Paul P, have you got any thoughts to add to that? And we'll have to wrap up in a minute or two.
No, I don't have anything else to add to that. If there's anything else you want to cover, things are popping.
Paul H, have you just on what Kathy was talking about there, or anything else you want to just add a final thought? Okay, okay, all right, that was quick. Right, in which case
there is an interesting question there from Stacey with regards to neurotypical and neurodivergent stress responses and mechanisms.
Yes.
What I'd urge all participants to do is really to look at the resources that are around them in their local agencies, communities, societies, groups, charities, and so on. There will be a number of organisations in your immediate geographical area and national area that you'll be able to tap into, who will be able to provide leadership and expertise to guide you in certain situations with certain groups that you interact with. So hopefully that's an immediate starter for 10, and you can do a Google search later on to find out what support is available for you specifically in relation to trauma with those with neurodivergent needs.
Okay, right. On that note, let's wrap the recording part of this up. We're a little bit over, and I always am because I always enjoy the conversations. But let's draw a halt to the recording and say a huge thank you to all of you, Paul H, Kathy, and Paul P, and say that I know I can say on your behalves that anyone who wants to reach out to you can do so. LinkedIn is easy. You've given your email addresses and so on. So I'd urge the audience or anyone watching the video to reach out and chat and follow up these questions. But I think it's really interesting. Those of you in the audience, thank you very much for joining in and for your comments and questions. If anyone's interested, just my little plug, in what we're doing at MedComms Networking, then medcommsnetworking.com is the place to go. And around it, there's a whole bunch of different resources, and you'll find lots and lots of things going on, and resources like NetworkPharma TV with lots and lots of videos and activity and so on. So please join in and certainly contact me if I can be of any help. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and we could go on a lot longer, but I'd like to draw the halt there. I think it's really interesting what you've raised, and I love the stress bucket analogy because it just makes sense to me, and I love the culture plaster thing. I'm going to use that, and as I say, we like our bowl of fruit, but there's probably some other stuff we need to worry about.
Thanks
as well.
for having us, Peter.
So thank you very much
for having us, Peter.
Lovely. I'm going to stop the recording, so everyone just give a quick wave and say bye, and have a good day. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.